using the telescopes, the big problem for him was, well, how do I sift through all this imagery? I'm just one person. And as part of his project, he estimated he had to go through about 50,000 images manually. Now, he would have liked to have relied on computers to do that, and people had built software to analyze and compare different galaxy formations. The problem is that there was a lot of false positives and false negatives, right? The computers made a lot of mistakes because they don't quite have the pattern recognition capabilities that humans do. We are, over many years of evolution, very well qualified to distinguish between different patterns. So he found himself doing a lot of this by hand. Then he thought about, well, what if I took kind of a Linux-like approach, or what if I found a way to actually open this up to a broader set of participants? And so what he did is he built a system where they could post all of this imagery online, and they developed a little short tutorial. It was about 10 minutes, and it was a bit of a test. They said, well, let's see if we put this up online and people come, if they can actually distinguish between an elliptical galaxy and a spiral galaxy with the same level of competence and accuracy as someone who is trained in that discipline. And as it turns out, 95% of the time after taking a short tutorial, people were able to do it. Well, this got on to the BBC, and pretty soon they had 200,000 people around the world helping them classify these galaxies. And now they're doing science at a pace that they couldn't have even contemplated before. And it's become more advanced. They've developed more complex taxonomies for people to fill out. And these people actually, they're not just part of the crowd, they're actually part of a community. They have meetups in places like London and Amsterdam. They have very active discussion boards. The scientists, treat them as sort of part of the community. They publish all of their results first to the community before they even put them in the scientific journals. So in many ways, they have become deeply invested in this whole project. So I think it's an interesting model to contemplate as you're thinking about, well, how do we deal with all of this data? Our computers aren't quite, coping with it yet. Maybe there's an opportunity to harness the sort of broader wisdom of the global population here. In government, we see lots of opportunities for new models of public service delivery, new models of democracy and democratic participation in policy making. But we started to see, some of those, I think, visions are perhaps a few years off in the future, but we've already seen good examples, particularly in the UK. So one of the problems that people face every day in their local communities is, how do I let my local officials know that I have a problem in my community? You may not know who to phone up. Well, this pretty smart local NGO called My Society set up this website and made it very simple. You simply go onto a map, and if somebody has vandalized something in your local neighborhood, or there's pothole issues, or whatever the case may be, you put it, you make a little note on the map, and that gets communicated directly to the local council. And then there's a little flag up there at the top. You can see it's red if the problem hasn't been fixed and green if it has been fixed. So there's sort of a feedback loop there so people can keep tabs on whether the local council is actually responding to the problems that have been identified. They've also built a site called They Work For You. So when I was over in London for a number of years, my representative was George Galloway, who you may remember caused a big stink on his sort of outspoken views on the Iraq War and so forth. But I could look up his voting record, all the committees that he sat on, his topics of interest, his expenses, his kind of views of note on particular issues. I mean, everything was out there in the open, and people could take advantage of a level of transparency into what their elected officials were doing that simply didn't exist before. If I wanted to make a Freedom of Information request, I wouldn't even have the foggiest idea how to go about doing that. And yet again, they've made it, so simple, just drop dead simple. You simply put, the name of the department or ministry from which you want information, and they do all the rest. You put the request. And the brilliant part is that, of course, all of the, requests that have been posted and the answers have been posted are documented on the site, so that, if you had the same idea as somebody else, that record will already be there, preventing the ministry then from having redundant requests over and over again for the same information. So these are the kind of practical things you can do just to enhance the relationship between citizens and their government. And what I think is we kind of think bigger about the big challenges that we face. Think about climate change. It seems to me that it's not sufficient just to have a legislative response, right? It's not enough just to put a price on carbon, not enough to have binding international agreements. I think ultimately what you need is a mass movement, a deep and fundamental change in the way that we use energy, the way that we consume products, and that's not going to happen without some form of social change. So what we're seeing now is although I have my days when I'm deeply skeptical. But we are seeing kind of neat tools that have been developed, for people to, for instance, take Carbon Rally, a community of about 40,000 people today who collectively take challenges. Let's change our driving habits for a week, and we'll all sign up to do that challenge, and we'll collectively evaluate our impact. If one person does it, it looks minuscule, almost irrelevant. If 40,000 people do it, it starts to look significant, and it creates a community around that kind of activity. Or, you decide to wash your clothes in cold water for a week, or whatever the case may be, but basically every 2 weeks they issue a new challenge, and the community responds collectively to that challenge. So that is just one small example of the kind of things that are happening. Now, just to kind of reflect on something that has been put out there, pretty broadly, I don't think actually a lot of this has to do with the wisdom of crowds per se. I think there's certain cases in which crowds could be smarter than the smartest individuals, but I think by and large actually the real issue here is that as a society we have these very large-scale complex problems, and yet we have very dispersed capabilities in the sense that no one institution, no one person, no one company, government, or scientific organization is, has the right equipment essentially to solve these problems in isolation. These problems demand collaboration almost by definition. And the fact that the knowledge and skills and capability required to solve them are distributed around the planet means that we have to find new and better ways to tap into that talent. And I think a lot of what we're thinking about is, what are those new models? How are they different from the traditional top-down hierarchical bureaucracies that we've seen for much of the industrial age? And I suspect that they are very different indeed, and is based much more on the Linux and Wikipedia model than it is on the traditional sort of military command and control structure. So I want to shift gears a little bit and sort of talk about what this means for the way that organizations operate, the way that they achieve competitive advantage in the marketplace, and even the kind of implications this has for broader systems like the energy grid and the human genome. So we didn't start out writing a book about talent management. In fact, we didn't even really consider it a talent management-like book, but it turns out that a lot of the implications actually pertain to the way that we think about and manage talent. Now, talent management is usually about managing the people that are sort of inside your corporate boundaries or your organizational boundaries, right? That's what talent management was all about. What we were trying to say with our book is that it's not just the talent inside, it's the talent outside, right? There's that kind of truism that the smartest people don't necessarily work for your organization, they work somewhere else. So our kind of orientation in mass collaboration was, well, how do you not only get the best out of the people that work for you full time, how do you exploit all of that latent capability, knowledge, and ingenuity that exists outside of your boundaries? So a good example is Procter & Gamble. Now, we certainly wrote about this in the book, and let me just sort of put the context in place here. They have 9,000 world-class R&D professionals inside of their labs. And yet, around the year 2000, 2001, 2002, they were having a real crisis. Their stock price was plummeting. Their innovation success rate had flatlined. They said, it didn't matter how much money we put into internal R&D. We simply weren't generating more innovative products, and they wondered why that was the case. It seemed like their sort of internal innovation model had stalled and become encumbered with bureaucracy and other problems. So the CEO did something quite radical. He said, within 5 years, we will source 50% of all of our products from outside of P&G. They will come from outside of our traditional corporate boundaries. And for a lot of people in the R&D organization, they said, well, what's going on here? What's wrong with us? And they kind of saw this as a bit of a put down. They said, no, it's not that. It's just we've done an analysis, and for every one of the 9,000 inside, we've identified another 200 outside who are just as good. Other people who are also doing cutting-edge science in other fields, in chemistry and biology and other fields that pertain directly to their products. And they said, we don't see any reason to downsize the 9,000, but what we want to do is find a way to exploit, the other 1.8 million, right? Because you do the math, 9,000 times 200, 1.8 million people. That's a lot of capability. So no company can afford to employ 1.8 million people full time, but they could, through the skillful use of collaboration and networks, exploit that kind of capability on an ad hoc basis. So take a network like Innocentive. You probably, many in the room have heard of